Hello, 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 hello. I am the welcomer and the mic check, I think. Good morning, everybody, on this brisk December day. I'm Rachel Pearson, the co-founder of Principal to Principal, along with my partner, Christy Rogers. I am here to say thank you for coming. I'm here to thank our partners in this endeavor, Silverado, who have been wonderful partners, and to thank you all for joining Principal to Principal today. Christy Rogers and I started working on supply chain issues right when COVID hit. Not unique, but we, I think, mapped out or charted a course for our engagement on the issue, which was different and was unique, and which was useful and created, drafted ideas and outcomes that were useful to the corporate world and to the Hill and to the administration, which makes us unique. This morning, as I'm wont to do at most events, I look for quotes for things, and the supply chain is fraught with politics, but I did find this quote from Supply Chain today, which I'm going to share with you to inspire or laugh, as the case may be. Everyone has the heart of a champion on game day. It's the heart you have during the weeks, months, and years of preparation that actually make the difference. From Supply Chain today. And that is what you all are doing here. If you'll indulge me for 1 second, my partner, Christy Rogers, is a supply chain expert. I am not. Hopefully I have other superpowers that have helped along the way. But her dedication to this and the work of the task force, patriotically, intellectually, and with amazing spirit and dedication has been really something to watch. So I want to publicly thank her and congratulate her for her work on this subject and the lens with which she has viewed it and done it. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here on behalf of Principal to Principal in Silverado, and I give you Christy Rogers.
Excellent. Awesome. Wow. Thank you, Rachel. I'm like, who is Christy? That's fantastic. No, it's been a passion of mine for a long time. As I've been literally involved in every crisis since 9/11 in the United States, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Iraq War, COVID, you name it. For whatever reason, the problems seem to find me. So we're here today. I thank you all so very much for joining us today. It's not as though there aren't tons of issues happening and requests on your time. So thanks for sharing your time, and thank you for eventually sharing your expertise today. So I will talk about that in a little minute. But as Rachel mentioned, we started Principal to Principal, the Global Supply Chain Task Force, in probably March to April of 20, very early in the COVID pandemic. We actually got phone calls from a Senate chairman and ranking member and their teams saying, hey, could you guys at Principal to Principal survey your Global Forum members and ask them what are some of the choke points, what are some of the obstacles in the supply chains of PPE, pharmaceuticals, and other medical equipment? So we sort of pulled together a team of experts with their hair on fire, and they said, okay, here are some things that legislators and policymakers can do. That turned into a task force. As Rachel said, we issued a recommendation report, briefed the Senate, briefed the White House Economic Council, and we turned our attention last year to semiconductors, which we sort of followed the same path. And then this year, we kept our attention on semiconductors, but have added critical minerals and rare earths, which is why you are here today. Our task force and our members of our task force, which span different sectors from academic experts, globally renowned experts in supply chain, to mining industry, to automotive, to manufacturing, to high tech, to healthcare, to communications. And they all said to us, hey, it's time we do a public forum. Everything else has been behind closed doors and kind of off the record. But we need to do a public forum because the urgency and complexity of the challenges surrounding the critical minerals and rare earths demands increased awareness. And so here we are today. And when I say we have to work together to address these issues, I mean industry, I mean governments. Not just the United States. We cannot do this alone. We need all governments, our allied governments, and everyone in the industry to band together to address these issues. And these issues, very simply put, demand and vulnerability. The demand is, according to International Energy Agency to U.S. Geological Survey, have said that the demand on critical minerals will increase threefold at a minimum over the next 10 years. That's due to the increased need for electricity. That's due to our demand and need for renewable energy sources. Threefold over the course of 10 years. That means we're going to need 300 more new mines, which on average globally, it takes a minimum of 17 years for a mine to go from exploration to extraction to operation. 17 years for one mine, we need 300 within 10 years to meet the demand. If that wasn't enough, we collectively, industry and governments, have created a vulnerability in our supply chain ecosystems of critical minerals over the past several decades. That vulnerability is that from 70 to 90% of the refining, processing, and production of critical minerals, 70 to 90%, depending on which mineral we're talking about, from cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, is refined, processed, produced in one region in the world, and that's Asia, specifically China. So when I said that we have to come together to address these issues, it's a serious need. We have to raise awareness. And there's opportunity right here in the Americas, right here in the Western Hemisphere, to come together to meet the demand, to actually come together to make our supply chains more resilient by regionally diversifying. This is for our collective economic security. This is for our national security. It's real and it's happening now, and we need all of you to get today to put your brains, your thoughts, your creativity to work. So in this endeavor for the past year, we have been working, as Rachel said, with our fabulous partners from Silverado, a collective brain trust of expertise from trade to the policy issues. And I'm going to introduce them in a second, but first, for really important things for the day. If you need coffee, it's not just in that back room. There's some coffee over here. Restrooms are out the door, past the elevators, past the registration desk to the right if you need a restroom. So with that, we're going to have Silverado set the scene. Again, I'll introduce in a second. We're going to go to our team of government experts from governments from around the world for a panel discussion. Then we're going to immediately go to our industry panel of experts and leaders in the industry in this space. We'll have a networking break right after that, which then we will all convene into our breakout sessions. And with 4 breakout sessions, color-coded, which will show you where you're going. You all have a task. That's to share your expertise, to come up with 3 action items that are realistic, where we, principal to principal in Silverado, will collect it, analyze it, pull it together with all the work we've done in the past year, turn it into a recommendation report that we'll issue in the first quarter of next year. So you have to stay for the breakout sessions. And because we're going to bleed your brains dry in the breakout sessions, we are then going to put you on buses and take you to the Embassy of Canada for a holiday reception with some levity, potentially some alcohol, maybe some members of Congress and some congressional staff if nothing is going on up there. So, all good? We're all set for the agenda? Fantastic. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dmitry Alperovich, who is the co-founder, executive chairman of Silverado, up here, Silverado Policy Accelerator, that is.
Thank you so much, Christy, Rachel, and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for making it to this terrific event. My co-founder, Maureen Hinman, and I co-founded Silverado almost 2 years ago as a nonprofit organization focused on novel policy solutions that can accelerate and solve the pressing national security challenges that we face today, particularly in the areas of trade and industrial policy, as well as ecological economic security, what we're calling EcoSec, and cybersecurity as well. Today's event is an example of the Policy Accelerator model in action. First, we did our homework to identify the challenges that we face and the opportunities related to the complex issues of the critical mineral supply chains. It didn't take us long to realize that securing a resilient supply chain for critical materials was necessary for national economic security objectives, from ensuring the continued development of clean technologies to face the challenge of climate change, to the manufacturing of semiconductors and many, many other applications. After analyzing the data on mineral reserves, current capacity, and projected demand, we felt compelled to help bring awareness to the supply-demand imbalance and the vulnerability of being too reliant on any one source or region for mining and processing. This led us to today's event, convening a formal combination of government policy expertise, brass tacks, corporate perspective and initiative, and subject matter experts and thought leaders, all here to provide the perspectives with the aim of leaving here with concrete next steps that can be taken. And I can assure you, having worked for several years now with Christy, she can make people work. So look for those breakouts. She's going to put you to work for sure. And of course, none of this would be possible without our great partners. Very pleased to be partnered with Principal to Principal and the Global Supply Chain Task Force members, many of whom you will hear from during our second panel. And I want to specifically call out our wonderful staff that worked so hard to put this incredible event together. Thank you all so much. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, the CEO of Silverado and Executive Director, Sarah Stewart, to set the scene for today's event. Thank you.
Okay, well, hard to follow those, but we thought it was important that we take the time, as Christy and Dimitri mentioned, to sort of level set with everybody here today before we hear from our panels. And my goal and my victory at the end of this day is if everybody comes away from this learning at least one new thing, I think that we've been successful. But then I ask you to pay it forward. And so whatever you learn, pass that on, and hopefully they pass it on, and we are able to really generate awareness. So getting started. I think just a few years ago, at least for many of us, critical minerals was rarely the topic of a dinner conversation. And now it is the topic that is driving people to get together for dinner and to come to events like today. So to start, let's answer a threshold question. What is a critical mineral? Critical minerals don't have a universal definition. Each country has its own list. But broadly speaking, these are minerals that are defined as critical because of their role in national security and economic development. Think cobalt, titanium, lithium, just as an example, and you can see here on the slide the whole range of critical minerals. Here we've shown just what the US and Canada list as critical minerals, and you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap. So why does this matter? Well, critical minerals underpin modern society, from aerospace and medical devices to semiconductors and to renewable energy applications and many things in between. And all of these applications are important to our national and economic security. So here you can see how, looking at the list of minerals running across the chart, you can see those that are essential to national and economic security for batteries, clean energy, semiconductors, just to name a few. When demand goes up in one sector, like we've heard Christy say, so say, for example, demand is going up for lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. The pot of minerals that supports those applications, it's finite. And so if demand's going up in one area, the pot is shrinking for all other areas. So we can see here that mineral demand is projected to significantly increase in the next 10 years, as Christy mentioned. Looking specifically at lithium, for example, 5 times the demand from 2021 to 2030. Based on our projections, this is going to lead to the need for hundreds of new mines by 2030, at least 300. And this is just looking at the minerals that we have listed on this slide, which is rare earth, vanadium, copper, nickel, lithium, graphite, and cobalt. Expanding production is key, but so is investing in other alternatives, like chemical substitutes or recycling of minerals to help with the supply and demand imbalance. Right now, many of these alternatives are top of mind, but they're also quite nascent. As shown in this graph, of 49 critical minerals measured, only about 1/3 have substitutes with good performance. More critical mineral recycling is also needed. We need to be putting more emphasis on creating reverse supply chains. But we need to know more about where the stocks are and invest in the infrastructure and technology needed to enable more recycling and less virgin extraction. Identifying and taking action to promote expanded mining, processing, and alternatives like recycled critical minerals is imperative because supply chain disruptions are more likely where production and processing are concentrated in one country or region. Here, we're taking just a look at the U.S. relative import dependence by origin for a range of minerals. A supply chain that is vulnerable to a single point of failure for any number of reasons, whether geopolitical, environmental, or otherwise, warrants a closer look to see how to bolster resiliency. I like this graph that the U.S. Geological Survey did, and it's based on the U.S., but I think it's illustrative. So here we're seeing that, for example, if the U.S. were to increase domestic supply through domestic mining, increase secondary production from recycled materials, and secure additional materials through trade with reliable and allied partners, while also investing in manufacturing improvements and in substitution, we start to see the U.S. net import reliance narrow. It's important to understand, though, that even with all of these strategies in play, the U.S. alone won't be able to meet the demand. There is still a need to work with allies and key partners. And so that's what brings us here today. We wanted to zoom in on the Western Hemisphere as a region of great potential for deeper critical supply chain partnership and opportunities. And of course, also to see all of our good friends in the region. So today we're going to focus just on a subset of critical minerals for our analysis. And we chose these cobalt, copper, graphite, rare earth, nickel, lithium, and vanadium. We chose these in particular because there are significant reserves or resources in the Western Hemisphere, and there's significant projected demand growth. But this is certainly not exhaustive of the resources in the region. So let's take a look here. The Western Hemisphere is a major supplier and source of production in the world, but more is certainly possible, which presents an opportunity. So you can see here, for example, copper and lithium in particular, the Western Hemisphere accounts for quite a large share of global production. Here, we're just taking a look at the global reserves of these minerals, and the Western Hemisphere accounts for a significant share. Again, lithium and copper are top of the list, but nickel, natural graphite, and the others also take quite a role. So with demand growing, and we look across the critical mineral supply chain, we can see that there is a real opportunity for the countries in the Western Hemisphere to focus on regional strategies to meet this opportunity, including along the entire value chain. So not just at the extraction stage, but also mineral processing, chemical production, and downstream products, where the value is increasing at each stage. Downstream value matters here, because when you look at exports in 2021, 65% of Western Hemisphere exports of ores and concentrates at that first stage were being exported outside of the region. And of the region's total exports of ores and concentrates, 85% were going to Asia for further processing. While there's some processing in the Western Hemisphere, only 38% of the resulting products are actually being traded in the region, and the rest is going to Asia. So why Asia? Let's take a look, and using batteries as an example. So if we look at the minerals that we need for batteries, for the production of batteries, Asia, and in particular China, dominates the global processing market for all of these various different minerals: cobalt, copper, graphite, lithium, nickel, and rare earths. When we get to the next stage, Asia also dominates in the value chain for the production of battery parts. And finally, Asia also accounts for the large amount of production of the battery itself. Batteries are just one example, and there are certainly others. So I think what we want to take away is that, Again, a single point of failure or regional concentration is a supply chain vulnerability, and more resiliency and diversity is needed along the supply chain. Here, we're taking a look just at the United States Free Trade Agreement partners and Trade and Investment Framework Agreement partners in the Western Hemisphere. There's a huge opportunity here to work with countries where we have a lot of long-standing economic relationships. Trade, investment, and growth can be fueled by working together. So our key takeaways for today, you can see, number one, critical minerals are necessary for national and economic security objectives. Multiple applications are drawing on the same pot of finite minerals. As demand grows, we need more mines and alternative strategies for resilient supply. Production and processing concentration in a single country or region is a risk. The Western Hemisphere has large potential to meet the growing demand along the value chain, and deepening partnerships with allies is key. So, what more can we do to create a more resilient supply chain and with other key allies so that we can create jobs, growth, and more resiliency? We are going to learn all of that today from our fabulous panels and bringing together everybody in our breakout sessions. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Farnsworth, who many of you know. There he is. Eric has a long-standing leadership role at the Council of the Americas, an esteemed career before that at the State Department, USTR, the White House, and the Senate. You've literally done everything. Everybody in this audience knows you, and we are so lucky to have you here to introduce and host our government panel.
I'm not quite sure how I respond to that, but that was terrific. Thank you very much for that intro. And do you want to bring the panelists on now? Or you want me to introduce them one by one? Panelists, come on in, and we'll get you seated. And as you're coming in,
Okay, I'm so sorry.
you're here. I was looking at Amos. Why don't you join us here at the dais? I know you guys. Come on, join. Come on. I'll introduce you when you get seated. It's all good.
Here. Okay.
All right. Anyway, as we're getting that going, let me do some introductions. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you. I want to thank Sarah, Christy, and Adina for putting this together. Very timely, and I'm looking forward to listening and hearing as much from the panelists as certainly talking. And so for me, this is a real opportunity to learn as well, and I'm really looking forward to that. Well, we're here, so let me do some quick introductions. We have an all-star panel. Starting from my immediate right, we've got Amos Hochstein, who really needs no introduction, and yet I'm going to do an introduction, right? So, but we'll keep them brief. We'll keep them all brief, and indeed shorter than each one deserves. But we want to begin to hear from them. He's Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security. He leads a whole of U.S. government effort to collaborate across the interagency, and only people in Washington actually know what that means. But with the private sector and with allies and partners around the world. Amos literally talks to the president and is somebody who is at the president's right hand on U.S. energy policy globally. So it is a real pleasure, Amos, to have you with us today. Dan Watson is the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for the Western Hemisphere, and he oversees the development and implementation of U.S. trade policy from Canada all the way down to Argentina and Chile and everything in between. He was also a lead negotiator for the USMCA, the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, right? So Daniel, it's great to have you with us. Great to see you again. And then we have two representatives from foreign embassies. Sarah Cohen is the DCM of the Embassy of Canada. And Sarah has a very long and distinguished bio, but I want to point out two things in particular. She was the Canadian senior official for preparations for the Summit of the Americas that the United States hosted in Los Angeles last June, so she has expertise in terms of the Western Hemisphere, but even more impressively, she served at Canadian embassies in Bogota, and she also served, I've there's another one here, Santiago, and so knows the region very well. Sarah, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much.
And then from Argentina, we have also the DCM of the embassy there, a good friend of mine, Minister Adrian Nador, who is an economist by training, career Foreign Service officer from Argentina, and he has expertise with both the World Bank and the IMF. He has also been an advisor to Mercosur, which is the regional trade grouping of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Would you please join me in welcoming all of these fine panelists? Well, we've heard the charge from the introductions, and it's a big charge, so let's get right into it. Amos, I'm going to go to you first. You know, the Biden administration has made energy transition, global climate change issues, technology leadership, all of the above and more central tenets of its priorities list. None of that is possible without critical minerals. Within that context, Latin America, as we've just heard, plays and can play an even larger role, a huge role, in looking forward to see how we meet these commitments and ambitions. Give us a sense of how you're looking at it from the perspective of the White House and your own portfolio.
Well, first, thank you very much, Aaron. Thanks for having me on this panel, and thanks for Silverado for doing this. Clearly, as you just mentioned, the Biden administration has, from its inception, seen the issue of energy transition as this is the greenest, most proactive administration we've ever had, putting an emphasis on the energy transition. Now, instead of just talking about energy transition, we always talked about it as how much wind are we installing, how much solar are we installing, and that was always the metric by which everybody measured. And the second measure was where are you on your Paris commitments, and what are your 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070 goals? Those are important. I'm not belittling that at all. On the contrary, I'm saying that has been the conversation. But what we're trying to do, what the president really wants to do, is to move towards implementation. How do you actually not just talk about these things, but you actually have to do them? And that's where the rubber meets the road. If you want to be in an energy transition that is accelerating, then you actually have to figure out, okay, how does the math work? What do I need if I want to put X amount of vehicles on the electric vehicles on the road? All right, how do I manufacture them? Where are they going to be manufactured? How do I incentivize hastening that process of building manufacturing sites? And then what's the supply chain that I need for it? How much steel do I need? How many batteries do I need? Okay, where are the batteries going to be made? What's going to go in the batteries? And so the critical minerals to us is part of this larger ecosystem of how do you get the product at the end of the day? How do you get that goal of faster deployment of, and that is true not just of electric vehicle batteries, that we need critical minerals and rare earths, but we need that also for solar and wind itself. I mean, you got to have the magnets for the wind turbines, and they require the same. And some of these materials are required for the chips that we are trying to accelerate through the CHIPS Act, which is, as everybody knows, is something that we're very proud of being able to do. And even with that achievement of what we're able to do through the CHIPS Act, we're still growing from a horrifyingly small percentage of what we manufacture in the United States to a less horrifying but still small percentage that we need to continuously grow. So this is growing American jobs and growing our national security, and this is something we're going to have to continue to do. So when it comes to the critical minerals themselves, we have to figure out a way to do a few things. One is to, can we mine some of this in the United States? And then can we process some of this in the United States? And the answer is yes to both, but not enough. So therefore, we have to connect the dots between what we're doing here at home through the IRA, incentivizing the business here, with how do we source the materials from outside and make sure that either as a processed material or as a raw material that is going to be processed in the United States. That is what this challenge that we face on critical minerals. That is, now you have to look at where are critical minerals. We don't get to choose who we do business with because that's been preordained by a few billion years of where they are underground. And that's where the mining comes in. Now, what we want to do is not just mine for critical minerals and find where they are and do the deals, but we have to offer a different proposition where we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and where the mining itself has to be cleaner, greener, more efficient, and more fair. And by more fair, I mean the traditional mining over the last 100 years has not exactly been an exemplar for governance, corruption, child labor, other labor standards, a broader participation in the market and the job market for more gender equity to allow for women to participate in that part of the economy. So we have all of these things that matter to us, that if we want to build a cleaner world, it's not just about making it cleaner, but it's about making sure that that electric vehicle you're driving, and you can take that entire value and walk back, that it matches our values, not just on climate, but that we're building a new world. This is the greatest transformation of the world's economy since the Industrial Revolution. We're not just unplugging one power system and plugging in another one. We're recreating it. And if we're going to recreate it, let's create it in a way that matches our values on a broader perspective. We are basically on the ground floor. No matter how much we've already done, we're on the ground floor of where we're going to be. So that's what we need to do. As far as the Western Hemisphere, it's absolutely one of the most critical places in the world. One, we are in the Western Hemisphere ourselves, and we have a responsibility to our partners and our neighbors. And I say the neighborhood is pretty long, so it's a long. It goes pretty far down, Chile and Argentina. But nonetheless, that is our hemisphere. And look at lithium, where Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile are that triangle of so much of lithium deposits and reserves around the world. Yes, we have it elsewhere. We have it in the United States. We have it elsewhere. But that is such a critical area. But what we have to make sure that we do is that the companies that are going to be chosen to mine it and what happens with those mining operations are ones that we feel both provide that security of supply, don't just create a new insecurity of supply by who is getting the licenses to mine them, and that they're living up to our standards. And that's what we want to do holistically as the U.S. government, is to see how do we help work with Argentina, with Chile, with Bolivia, with other countries to make sure that both we have access to the lithium. And again, this is about diversification of resources. I'm not saying we should all come to the United States. This has to be a diversified value chain, but we want to be part of that. And whether it's even in nickel in Brazil, and we made an announcement that the U.S. government just invested through TechMed in a Brazil cleaner nickel mining operation, hope to expand that. It's at its initial phase now. So these are the things that we can do across the Western Hemisphere to work to make sure that there is a broader integration through interconnection between the supply chain that can come from Western Hemisphere and supply what we need in the United States, but not just for the United States, but this has to be broadly for the global market as we create a more fair, balanced, diversified energy system that is much more so on all of those accounts than the fossil fuel energy system that was built in the 19th and 20th century.
I'm going to come to Sarah, you in just a second, but Amos, let me follow up on that because I really appreciate you overlaying that. Let me, right away in this conversation, mention the C word, which is China. Western Hemisphere is a huge supplier. China is the #1 trade partner of almost every country in South America, and much of that has to do with commodities, certainly critical minerals is part of that. Where does this, and I won't use the word competition, but where does this issue fit in terms of calculations among the United States senior leadership in terms of the strategic importance of the Western Hemisphere? And does this drive the thought process within the interagency and within the discussions coming out of, well, say the Summit of the Americas in June or other initiatives like that? Where does that fit? And then I'm going to follow up with Sarah.
Well, as you know, the president launched together with his G7 colleagues at the G7 last summer the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which was to work together worldwide, and Western Hemisphere is actually one of the places where we're working a lot with our G7 partners, plus Australia and other countries. And we did another event at the G20 with a broader subset of countries as we expand this initiative. And yeah, China has been at this for longer, for about, longer than over a decade that they've been making significant investments. I'm never going to suggest that China shouldn't be part of the value chain and the supply chain for the world. I want to make sure, though, what I really want to focus on, if China wants to come to any country in Western Hemisphere and invest and make sure that labor laws are followed, that it is open and transparent, and that we know what the contracts are and who's getting paid and how they're getting paid. And if we know that the standards and how clean the operation is, and that we know that there's no insistence that all the material go to China for processing, but rather so we don't have one processor for the world, but we have multiple processing facilities across the world. If all those standards, and that there's no loans that are created that will, kind of a zero interest loan that gets you really indebted later on, if you remember a certain crisis we had in the United States on interest-free loans. What happens when they mature is called Sri Lanka, and that's or to some degree Ecuador in the Western Hemisphere, right? So you take a loan today for zero interest, you may not be the prime minister or president that has to pay it off when those interest levels rise later. So if China is willing to work with us in that context along those that value proposition, great. Let's do it. Let's all do that. And let's all make investments in this, because we all need to accelerate this process. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's happening at the moment, but I think we'd all be very happy to see China joining us on a values-based investment in the next generation, and not having batteries for electric vehicles manufactured with an enormous amount of coal in the processing facilities, which kind of defeats the purpose of why we're switching our entire vehicle fleet from a gasoline to electric. So yes, we're competing with China, we're competing with a lot of others. That's the nature of business. I think that's true with China, true with everybody else. We always compete, and every country competes, and that's a good thing. Healthy competition, as long as it's based on a certain set of rules and values, I think there's nothing wrong with competition. But we do have to have that set of values. So what we are trying to say is, I would be very worried in the Western Hemisphere with my friends that are sitting on this panel with me in other countries, if we wake up one day and the 60 to 90% of the investment and ownership of infrastructure, of mining rights, are in one country, are from one country or one company. Don't make it all from the United States. Don't make it all from China. Don't make it all from anywhere. Let's have a diversified energy system. Have your own diversification. Now, you're right that China's already invested a lot, so maybe this is the time to start thinking, okay, what do I do a little bit differently to make sure that we can raise the standards of living for our countries, so that we can raise the income level, and that we're part of this, not just a supply of raw material. Maybe there could be some, sort of further downstream from the mining in countries across the Western Hemisphere, and be part of this new ecosystem, because this is not going away. Washington, D.C. is the last place where we're still talking about, is there such a thing as climate change, and should we be investing in renewable energy or not, in a cleaner future? That's not a policy decision anymore. That's not a political issue. I don't care what party you're from. That's where the money is being spent. Follow the money. That's where we're going to be. There will be, in 2030 and 2035, a significant part of the new car sales are going to be electric, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. That's going to happen. Ford is going to hire 10,000 employees in Tennessee and Kentucky, not because they check their political affiliation, but because that's where they want to build those factories. They're going to be for electric vehicles. That's what is going to happen. So if we follow that money, and we know that's where we're going to be, I think every country should think, how do I get myself prepared for that and be part of it, so that I can attract the investment, and that my people look back one day, a couple of years from now and say, we're part of it, not only as a country, but as workers and as a society, and we're benefiting from it.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom there, lots of things to follow up. I want to bring others into the conversation, obviously, but thank you for that. And I have to say, you know, your discussion of business practices and comparative business practices, I think, is absolutely relevant, not just in Latin America, but in emerging markets generally. And it does matter where the investment's coming from, and it does matter how the implementation occurs. And I want to go to Sarah in that context, because Canada and the U.S. have been working together very closely and with other partners around the world, Australia, but also in the Western Hemisphere, in terms of a word we haven't really used yet in the panel, securing critical minerals, right? I mean, we're talking about this in a national strategic context, in a national security context, in an economic future context. Amos talked about projections to 2070. That's the first time I've ever talked about, you know, in the long run, we're all dead, right, according to Keynes, but in any event. But, you know, security of supply matters, and what China is doing right now is trying to lock in the supply for China. And so I wonder, from the Canadian perspective, how you all are seeing this and some of the things you're seeking to advance within the Western Hemisphere context, starting with the U.S.-Canada relationship.
No, super. Thanks, Eric. And it's a real pleasure to be here on behalf of the embassy, on behalf of Ambassador Hillman. We're looking forward to hosting you all over lunch and hearing the results of your deliberations over the course of the day. You know, Eric, this risks being a panel where we all strenuously agree with each other, where we strenuously agree with Silverado and principle to principle. But maybe just a few words on the Canadian approach. You know, we depart from the premise that, as others have sort of alluded to, there's no global energy transition without investment in critical minerals. And so how do we get there? And if I were to talk about the Canadian approach here, we depart from the premise that Canada has a really strong value proposition in terms of, you've seen what we are able to mine, what we are able to process, what we are able to manufacture, what we are able to recycle in our own country. We also depart from the premise that this really needs to be about exploiting the full value chain within Canada, but also not duplicating what we are able to do in an integrated way with the United States, with our other partners in the hemisphere. Eric very kindly rattled you off my bio. I have firsthand experience of the Canadian value proposition in the extractive sector in many parts of South America. I've spent a large chunk of my career working with partners in the full Western Hemisphere space. This is a deeply integrated concept in terms of our economies. Canada and the US is obviously a place where there is deep integration of our economies, including with Mexico as well in the context of the North American partnership. We have deep integration as well with various parts of the region. The auto sector is a pretty obvious example where we do not duplicate effort across borders. Instead, we seek to align. Electric vehicles is not going to be a different conversation. This needs to be an area where the full value chain is mapped across borders, where we're not duplicating efforts. Everybody has agreed, I think, that there is too much work to be done to catch up, frankly. The timing is now, and so let's make sure that we are doing it in a way where our respective economies can benefit from the knowledge transfer, from the upskilling, from the creation of good and important economic opportunities for our citizens across the full value chain, but in a way that also benefits the exports and the production and the manufacturing and the sales throughout the entire hemisphere. Canada and the US, this is going to be a key factor for Canada as we go forward. We have just launched our own critical minerals strategy that came out on the 9th of December. It's pretty exciting to be able to talk about this topic in that context. I've rattled off a few of the areas where we plan to focus. The US, definitely key. Other partners, also key. And underpinning all of this is the conversation about our values. For Canada, that's really about responsible investment. It's about environmental stewardship. It's about close and deep collaboration with our Indigenous communities, as well as a core tenet of Canada's reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and making sure, as I said, that economic benefits are really accruing to the full range of our citizens in a responsible, in a transparent, and an important way. And there's a number of ways that we've worked closely with the US, that we're working with other partners. You know, there's only so much that government can or should do in this space. I think we all agree, and I think the next panel with industry will give us some really interesting insights in terms of what industry is looking for from government. But it's really about what are the signals that we're putting into the marketplace, what are the incentives. I think there are clear examples between Canada and the US Our most recent critical mineral strategy, as I mentioned, is a commitment from the Canadian federal government to invest close to 4 billion Canadian dollars in the sector across the full range. The U.S. has obviously, with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and with the Inflation Reduction Act, sent similar signals into the market. How are we joining up? How are we consistent? Well, frankly, we're extraordinarily consistent. And I think there are a number of mechanisms that we've developed with the U.S. going back 3-4 years, including our joint action plan on critical minerals, which I can talk about if there's interest. There needs to be more work in that space. There needs to be more dovetailing in that space. Pandemic slowed us down a little bit, but we are definitely in a space where a lot of good work has already gone into clarity and mapping around geological deposits, around relationship building, around opportunities and seminars, and we're looking forward to more in that space. For Canada, this is also about complementarity with our provinces and our own local regulations, and I think you'll see in our strategy as well that regulatory issues is something that we're committed to working with across all levels of government, and I think that is something that we have learned is necessary in this space. And then, of course, there is the issue of labor standards and transparency and the values proposition. Just yesterday, on the margins of the COP15 biodiversity meetings that are being held in Montreal, in Canada, a group of countries, including Canada and the US and Australia and a number of G7 partners, announced, and sorry, I just need to get the name right here, the International Sustainable Critical Minerals Alliance. So that's a good step forward in terms of looking at how do we incentivize ESG in this space? How do we incentivize appropriate environmental stewardship and send signals into the market that these are areas that as you make the economic calculus of where do you sell and where do you manufacture and where do you do processing, there are countries coming together like Canada and the US and a number of our partners internationally to send those signals into the market about what is appropriate in that space. There are other groupings, the Intergovernmental Forum on Sustainable Mining, which the US has recently joined, the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, and of course the Mineral Security Partnership. We can also talk about state-owned enterprises, and Canada's made some recent changes to our Investment Canada Act, which put limits on where state-owned enterprises can invest in the critical minerals value chain, and a couple have been asked to divest. So those are just some examples, I think, Eric, of where we are working with the U.S. about the Canadian approach in this area, and where we're looking forward to working more closely with partners.
I think it's fantastic. Let me push you a little bit on the Latin American aspect of this.
No,
but in a good way. We're friends.
No one wants
and I hope we will be after this panel, too. Exactly. You know, you've laid out a menu of really good work that's being done. U.S., Canada, G7, developed countries. Is there an intent, a desire, an opportunity to take this good work that's being done among developed nations and to begin to integrate the voices of Latin America, and I'm going to come to Argentina next, in terms of, you know, if we're looking to lock in not just, you know, supply chains, but we're actually looking to lock in a bigger values set. It seems to me that there's an opportunity here to be talking with countries in the Western Hemisphere, and we all know, look, Latin America's complicated. You all know what's going on right now in Peru, I mean, right now, right? You all know what's going on in Chile in terms of the referendum that they're going to try again in terms of, you know, constitutional reform. This is Chile. This is a stable, long-term democratic friend and ally. So, you know, there are complications in the region, and my question, I guess, is a leading question to be sure, but it's to say, you know, look, can countries like the U.S. and Canada collaborate to draw in countries in the Western Hemisphere in a way that's mutually beneficial?
I mean, that's a short answer to that probing question. Of course we can. I think there's a number of initiatives, and I'm sure Daniel will talk about the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, launched in LA. You know, from the Canadian perspective, we have a number of free trade agreements in the region. Eric, you mentioned Chile. There's a government in place that is deeply committed to the clean energy transition. There's a government in place in a country that rolls on the commodities cycle and has for decades, where Canada has a very strong and deep and rich history in the extractive sector. Through those partnerships in countries like Chile, in other parts of the region, Peru is a whole conversation that we will probably want to have separately. But there is enormous scope. I think there's enormous willingness. I think you build off the basis of some pretty bedrock, and I'm sorry, that's a terrible extractive sector joke, relationships that have fundamentals where you can have these conversations, and where, as these international groupings come together that are a bit loose right now and that are a bit guided by voluntary commitments, people, as I think Amos described, countries that want to abide in that space and want to project signals in that space and want to operate on a values basis in that space, absolutely, let's keep that conversation going. Let's figure out the mechanisms that make the most sense. Like I said, Canada has a range of free trade agreements and a history in the extractive sector there. Canada and the US have worked collaboratively in the Hemisphere through the Organization of American States, bilaterally through our missions on the ground for decades. I personally can attest to that. And I think there's a deep commitment, and I think there's also a deep understanding that the economic future of the region depends on navigating this space. I would say, in my experience, diversification of exports remains something that many countries in the region are interested in. The value proposition has to be there. The economic argument has to be there. And the knowledge that they are acting in good company and working with close and trusted partners needs to be there. But I think those are all fundamentals that are already on the table. So I'm optimistic, Eric, that we can deliver on what you're asking us to do. And we're pretty committed as Canada to advancing in that space.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And Adrian, we're going to come to you in a second. But that's precisely the point that I'm trying to make. And if you couldn't tell already, my personal sort of underlying agenda here is to find out how can the Western Hemisphere be more united around these issues in a mutually beneficial way. Because oftentimes we have these conversations where it's north to north and south to south and emerging markets to this and then that, but we don't talk to each other and we don't see ourselves in an integrated way. And from the Council of the Americas perspective, in over 30 years of doing this, I can say that oftentimes in Washington, Latin America is overlooked, particularly in natural resource and particularly in areas where there should be a strategic component. This is my preaching now, but the strategic component of U.S. national interests. And the opportunities are huge, and we're not the only players. There are others out there who are actively seeking to take advantage. And so let's go to Argentina, because Argentina is sitting on a pile, that's a technical term, a pile of lithium. Right? As well as other critical minerals, as well as a great amount of beef and Malbec and wonderful things like that. And if you haven't been to Argentina, go quickly because the dollar goes very far and you can come back with a boatload of leather jackets, which I wouldn't know anything about that, but Argentina, fabulous place these days. Adrian, we're going to go to you. Obviously, Argentina has been collaborating very closely on lithium.
Yes.
Particularly with the neighbors, with Chile and with Bolivia, and talking about things like the OPEC of lithium. Now, that's a different conversation than we're having in North America and that we've just been having. But at the same time, the government of Argentina has, I think, been very effective and very forthcoming about coming to Washington and elsewhere, saying to U.S. investors, we have an incredible opportunity. Why aren't you doing more to take advantage of it? So you do have that sort of tension somewhat. Tell us how the government is looking at these issues from your perspective, and then I'll do a follow-up question with you as well.
Thank you, Eric, for the question. Again, my boss, Ambassador Arguello, was really looking forward to being here with you to discuss this critical issue. But unfortunately, he came from a trip from India with some mild fever, and he was not feeling well today, so he had to decline last minute. So I'm here on his behalf, sending his regards. Thank you, Christy, Maureen, Dimitri, Rachel, Eric, for this kind invitation. Argentina as a responsible citizens, like other countries, like the US, Canada, and I would add also China in that respect. We all have to play a part in this serious challenge for existential challenge, which is climate change agenda. We fully agree with the U.S. government, with the leadership President Biden has been taking on this issue. John Kerry, they are doing a great job. energizing this agenda. We fully agree with that, and we want to play our part. As it was said, Maureen's presentation was very abundant in numbers and details. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, we have between 15 and 20% when measured in economic viability of the world reserves in the lithium case. We are working hard. I guess we have probably the most liberal regime for the extraction of lithium, probably. In the region, I would say without any doubt. Probably in the world, there are not restricted minerals in the regime, and there is a low taxation in my perspective. There's a discussion on that, but that's stable. It's long-term stability. That those are the rules of the game. We are in a peaceful area of the world. Argentina is a democratic country and a stable democracy, and that's a great asset nowadays. So we have the conditions in place. We have 20 projects developing nowadays in the lithium, just only for that. And if Maureen said, if I understood correctly, if we need to increase fivefold the production of lithium by 2030, our expectation is that we will be increasing tenfold by 2030, if these 20 projects are taken to the production stage, which is a long time. Somewhat, she said 17 years. In the lithium sector, it will be 10 years probably the average. But we have these 20 projects. We have international companies helping us. They are key players. We highly value the partnership with countries like-minded countries like the US and Canada. For instance, we had a meeting last week with the Canadian Minister of Labour at our embassy, Seamus O'Regan. He was there. So we were discussing how our sector in Argentina had embraced towards sustainable mining standards developed by the Canadian Mining Association. That was one of the topics of the discussion. So we take very seriously the sustainable dimension. So, and I cannot agree more with what has been said by the previous speakers on basing our exploitation, basing on values. I will include also value added, not only values as you were referring to, but also value added, because if there is a political reality, as I understand it, and I'm a foreigner, I could not comment on issues of the U.S. foreign policy, for instance, but this is a political reality.
Go ahead.
There is a political reality in terms of decoupling from China in critical sectors. We fully understand that. It's structural. It's something which is beyond our domain, and it's going to happen as we see it. There are also political realities in a country like Argentina, which is a federal republic, where the subsoil resources belong to the provinces, to the subnational governments. And there are political realities for those governors and the lawmakers, the legislators there, to get the most of the resources they have. So the issue of value added is critical. That's what the governor says. We, from the embassy, managed to bring the three main provinces, Salta, Catamarca, and Jujuy, by late September here to the U.S. We forced that. They were willing to come. We brought the governors to the State Department and to some other places to engage in the discussions. And the thing they referred as the main concern is that we need to add value locally, right? So, and what is that we require? Probably it's one of the follow-up questions, but we will require the full engagement of the international companies, which we really value and think the conditions in terms of profitability and regulations are there for them to come, and they are coming. But we need more of them. But we also need that the incentives, and I will refer now to briefly to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not a theoretical concern we may have, because some companies, international companies, not Argentine companies, approach the embassy and ask us to be vocal and speak to the U.S. Officials that we are doing, because they have concerns that their projects underway may face some difficulties if the local, let's say, these subsidies attached to local content are not extended to other countries beyond partners with free trade agreements. We heard that the President Biden, when Macron visited Washington last week, I guess, or a couple of weeks ago, made clear that that was a discussion, last minute drafting at Congress. And obviously we believe what he says, without any doubt, and that will be corrected. We look forward to getting a level playing field, because, again, for those local political realities, in a context of scarcity, in the case of lithium, that's particularly the case. So you will get more demand than supply. And there are incentives, so rules of the game, which penalize the companies, international companies, which are not Argentine, are international, Australian, penalize them to export to the U.S. That rules of the game would be counterproductive in my humble assessment of the U.S. foreign policy objectives, because it would be forcing those international companies to sell their produce to other countries or other areas which do not share necessarily the values we share, and that would be unfortunate. So we are optimistic, because we understand that was not the drafting of that is in a democracy is what the Congress decided, but there are further instances. The Treasury Department has to issue their detailed regulation as implementation agency, and these things can be amended in a favorable way, and that's part probably of what APEP, the meaning of this, the APEP of this great initiative launched by President Biden in Los Angeles could be useful for, right? To let's extend to the Western Hemisphere, to the friends, to the secure. We want to be secure partners. We are friends. We are there. We want to deepen and strengthen our participation in this regional value chain, without any doubt.
We're going to get to that in just a second. But before we do, to highlight what a couple things that Adrian has said, the federal nature of the Argentine system means that the states have control in some way of the extractives policy. And it's a really important point. And we don't have time to get into it, but for those of you who are investing or plan to invest in Argentina, that matters, because that makes potential investments and returns potentially more attractive for a variety of reasons. So it's an important point. The second point, and one that I want to follow up on, is you and Amos and Sarah, I think, have all mentioned value added, which I think is a critical component. Latin America is well known for primary goods, commodities, that then get shipped somewhere else. Value is added somewhere else, and then the final product is shipped back to Latin America. And so the region doesn't get that delta in terms of shifting and gaining value. Lithium is a perfect example, and something I've been asking for, 10 years or so, since the lithium deposits became relevant globally. Why are we talking about lithium mining and not batteries production? Why are we talking about primary commodities extraction and not adding value, working with auto companies, working with power generation companies, working with battery technology, working with clean energy, and all these things? And I wonder, from that perspective, because Argentina has some exciting things in that way, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how your government is viewing this and opportunities for investment in that sector, because at the end of the day, this is a value to the Argentine people, no, in terms of development of the country itself.
Oh, yes, we are really following up the developments in the U.S. We see the onshoring of this value chain in the U.S. I have said it in a previous meeting with principal to principal, the same, as an opportunity, as an opportunity. However, the rules of the game need to be carefully calibrated in order to benefit the whole region. that's obviously my interest and my perspective, and I am optimistic that that will be the case. And at the end of the day, onshoring in the U.S., I mean, because it's such a complex value chain, you cannot expect that in Argentina or in other smaller countries we can develop the whole range of things. It's too complex, and obviously we have the aspiration to make a contribution in a minimum part of it, right? But we need to process the raw material.
Yeah.
That's why there is some sensitivity on what the IRA finally would be, how it will be implemented.
Yeah.
But we are really optimistic, and we think that this is going to be done properly in a good way, and we all. It's not only that the U.S. sees itself as a leader of the West world. The other countries also perceive the U.S. roles in that respect, and I guess that the role of a leader is to ensure that all benefit from, and that I'm sure that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, and thank you for being willing to take on some difficult questions. Daniel, you've been very patient. Thank you for that. APEP has come up several times in conversation. Mm-hmm. For those who may not know what that is, please give us a sense of what is APEP, what's the vision, and what is USTR, but more broadly the U.S. government, doing to try to implement this vision that was first announced by the president in Los Angeles at the Summit of the Americas last June?
So before I do that, so I'll get to APEP. I do have limitations of what I can say about that initiative because it's still very much in preparation. But I would start with our free trade agreement. So the team at Silverado did a great job with their graphic, stressing that the Western Hemisphere is a place where we have most of our FTAs. And then we also have a network of trade and investment framework agreements. So the FTAs are important because there is already a basic enabling environment that's been created. We have tariff-free trade with a very large segment of the hemisphere. We have the fundamental rules of trade and investment that are in those agreements, and those have really shaped our engagement with those countries now for going on 20 years, in some cases much longer in the case of USMCA. But one thing that's maybe less understood about those agreements is that they also have institutions built into them. There's a wide range of committees. There's the Free Trade Commission, which meets periodically at a high level. And part of what I want to stress there is that under this administration, when we're looking at trade differently and trying to respond to new challenges like the transition to clean energy, supply chain resiliency, all these big themes, we do have the tools to address those within the structures of those agreements, and we are increasingly looking at that. I think all of you have heard about the administration's worker-centered trade policy, so the focus on sustainability, workers' rights, environment, inclusivity in our policymaking, including broad consultations. These are all things that feed into the living nature of those agreements. In addition, we have in the region these trade and investment framework agreements, which in the past were I kind of looked at as a sort of training wheels for an FTA negotiation. But we've actually been very active in those arrangements, negotiating substantive obligations similar to those in the USMCA with Brazil, Ecuador, and Uruguay on good regulatory practices, anti-corruption, trade facilitation. Again, these very fundamental rules of good governance that form this enabling environment for trade and investment. We just had a really great meeting of our Argentina TIFA in Buenos Aires. It was a lovely trip and also very nice meetings.
Did you come back with leather jackets?
No leather jackets, okay. But a lot of places to go next time I go.
There you go.
So, but we also had a very developed segment of discussion on this very issue and other supply chain related issues, which was extremely productive. They brought a lot of their experts to the table. And the reason I say this is that these structures that exist under our trade agreements and trade arrangements are a very good place to have detailed technical discussions about concrete issues. So at USTR, we are very, very focused, because we negotiate primarily legally binding obligations, we are very focused on concrete actions. We work very closely with technical agencies, and I think one of the values that USTR brings to the table is we are able to convene experts to get to concrete outcomes. So APEP. That bilateral engagement that we have with our FTA partners, with our TIFA partners, will always be fundamental. It's very important to us. It's very important to them. It's very important for these sort of initiatives as well. The APEP, though, is a different sort of animal. It will have elements of trade, recognizing that much has already been achieved in the region, so there are certain things that don't need to be done. We don't need to talk about tariffs when we've eliminated tariffs for most of the region. But it also creates an opportunity to talk about things differently and bring to bear different types of tools and discussions. So we will be co-leading that initiative with the State Department. But that'll include a very broad range of discussions on things like different approaches to development finance, matters related to Social Security, and obviously labor, climate, a wide range of issues. And the benefit there is it's kind of the perfect place to talk about these types of issues. I can't say too much about this again because the detailed agenda of that agreement is still being worked out. Obviously, everything we do is very much informed by our consultations with the Congress and stakeholders, who are very varied and important to those discussions. So you'll be hearing more about that soon. But this is definitely one of those spaces where we will be working this from a regional perspective, on top of the bilateral engagements that we have in our free trade agreements. So there's actually a huge amount of potential for discussions on these areas. However, again, from our perspective, being USTR, we are really focused on concrete outcomes. And what's really important to us is whenever we talk to our trading partners in any of our bilateral venues, they all are very excited about this concept of friendshoring or nearshoring, huge amount of interest. And then, of course, many of the countries in the region are placing a very, very high priority on responding to the climate change and the transition. So we talked about the sort of like turn in the region, and that's certainly true. But that creates challenges, but also opportunities. So we have new governments in Chile and Colombia. We have Peru, which is
you have a new government there
in a
too.
Transition space. But we have a new government in Brazil starting soon. There are challenges, but there are also opportunities, particularly in the labor and environment space. And those countries have been very active in coming up with ideas. So we really look forward to this sort of cooperative work under the APEP to move some of this forward. But critical for us is having sort of actionable input from knowledgeable stakeholders. So on something like critical minerals, or really any of the supply chain issues that we're thinking about, because that's very much part of our thinking, we really need to have well-informed, concrete guidance from all the different players, including industry, for near-term, medium-term, and long-term. We need to think about where we want to go with these big initiatives. This is actually not the way we've thought about trade and investment in the past. Mm-hmm. So we're all kind of learning what we need to do to create those incentives, to change the marketplace. And that's where and I think it's actually fairly new for industry to be thinking about it in this way too. So we need to work together to sort of make that as concrete as we can for our engagement with the APEC partners when we come to the table.
One of the things you mentioned, which I totally agree with, well, I agree with everything you said, but what I really want to emphasize is the point that you made in terms of FTAs with the United States serve as a stabilizing force in the region. And you mentioned Chile, Peru, but the other countries as well. And I would absolutely agree with that, because there are certain things that countries just find it inconvenient to do based on agreements that they have with the United States. Having said that, many of these agreements are, a generation old, 15, 20 years old. Yeah. And they don't include certain provisions like digital and, probably could be updated in other ways too, certainly with the Biden administration's current trade policy. Do you see APEP as a way somehow to update some of these existing agreements as well, or is this a layer on top that you all are envisioning you might put on?
Yeah, more the latter.
Yeah.
So all of that is true. So we have, at this point, since we've just, redone the NAFTA with the USMCA, Chile would be one of our oldest free trade agreements at all.
Yep.
So we have many countries in the region where the FTAs are actually closer to the original NAFTA model than they are to the newer USMCA for all those things you mentioned. And it's not just digital trade, but it's also state-owned enterprises, which we were talking about. It's good regulatory practices. It's the new standards on labor and environment. It's some of the non-market economy issues that we've been talking about. There's a lot in the USMCA that is not in those older agreements. Now, because we do have those institutions, and then we always have the option of talking about new elements. That is a place to do that. The APEP is also a place to do that. But again, the APEP will be a broad regional initiative that will sit alongside those bilateral agreements. So I think we're going to have to determine how quickly we move and with whom. But it is definitely the case that our leadership at USTR is very much of the mind that free trade agreements are living arrangements that are there to be worked on and improved. They need to keep pace with the change of the economy. And then the APEP is, of course, something that will happen as well. Legally, they can coexist and sit next to each other. They're just a different sort of discussion between the more focused bilateral and the broader regional perspective.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, watch this space because there will be forthcoming information, and we are anxious to hear that. We have about 10 minutes to go, so I want to come back to Amos and give everybody else a chance as well for one final bite at this particular apple. But, Amos, you've heard what's been said. One of the things that probably requires emphasizing is that some of these ambitions, probably many if not all of these ambitions on behalf of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, require the active participation of the private sector, right? I mean, we're not China. We can't just determine where our investments are going to go. Talked about SOEs, state-owned enterprises, et cetera, but private sector companies make your own decisions based on your own realities and cost of, well, all that reality. The question is, when you're discussing these issues, what are you hearing from the private sector in terms of some of the things they believe that they need to make the Western Hemisphere a more attractive or, a bigger share of their global investment play?
Well, I think a lot has been said here, a lot that I agree with, and some that I probably take some exception with, specifically on the IRA. But look, if you want to attract private sector, specifically U.S. private sector, but I think that this is broadly speaking,
sure.
Industrial, any company from an advanced economy that is going to look to make investments anywhere in the world, they're going to look for the same things. One is the availability of the product, so we can check that. We have the availability of the product. The commodity's there. Now you got to look at all the other risks that are there because the countries that we're talking about here are not the only ones that have this product. So yes, there's competition, as you mentioned. China and other countries are willing to make the investment, but the competition also is because what's the commodity risk? What's the currency risk? What's the governance risk? What's the reputational risk? And sadly, the reality is that in several markets where the product may be, those risks outweigh the benefit. And if there's not a security of making a decent return on the business side, that's fine. That's the risk that everybody should be willing to take. What return you get, that's ultimately the decision. But if you're worried that there's going to be some intervention that is going to prevent you from getting that return, if you're not secure in the legal rights that you will have and the ability of the judiciary to fairly adjudicate, if you have concern about where the currency is going to be as a result of geopolitical events in any country, then and the enabling environment that's there, that is ultimately what's going to drive. The private sector is a lot less ideological about this. Mm-hmm. If they're not saying that we want electric vehicles or don't want electric vehicles. If the curve on a lithium price or a cobalt or nickel or copper is going to be X, then I'm going to make the investment because it takes the 10 to 17 years, and in some cases I hope that we can shrink some of that. But I need to know that when I put $1 billion in the ground over the next 5 years, that I'm going to get this return once I start producing, and that the enabling environment is still going to be the same. I don't think that that the Western Hemisphere has done all it can to put itself in a competitive place for that. And I think we have to be honest in these conversations, so we can all be friendly, but we have to be honest that if we want to be able to compete, if we want to be able to get to the next level of being able to have this energy transition in a faster basis, then we can't just say all the nice things. We have to say the reality, and that is that there has been some difficulty around this. And that's what we in the United States are willing to look at this, straight on. Let's be honest. Let's level set. And what do we do to help the governments that are willing to take those actions? How do we, as G7 countries and Australia and others, come and say, we are willing to step in to mitigate some of this risk? We are willing to come in and say, you don't have a credit rating, and therefore no bank is going to finance a $1 billion investment. So we need to come in and figure out, how do we step in as the credit provider? Or how do we step in and provide enough financing? We're not going to compete dollar for dollar, but if we can provide enough financing that that covers the political risk, not just from a political risk insurance product that you buy, but that we can actually come in, and the fact that there is an American flag, a Canadian flag, German, whatever it is, that says we're invested in this, whether it's Canada or KfW or DFC and Exim, we're in this project. And I think that's what we were able to do and demonstrate in the nickel project in Brazil, is to say the US government is now a shareholder, essentially, in this. So if we're willing to take the risk and we're there, I think others are willing to come and say, other private sector actors are now willing to say, okay, the Americans have put American taxpayer dollars in there. They're not going to I have some insurance policy here. And it's not going to be good enough rhetorically. We're going to have to take actions of putting our money where our mouth is to support these kinds of enabling environments. So I think that is going to be the key if we want more private sector investment in this. And I would just say that as we look at the IRA, and yes, the president was very clear that some provisions we will, as we go, we haven't yet finished the regulatory system of how we're going to put this in play. But at the end of the day, we need to accelerate the investment. And instead of looking at what everybody's uncomfortable with, this is the most monumental, largest investment in climate ever. And we're not going to back away from that. This is our commitment to making the investment. And there are other countries that are making these same investments but everything has to be there. And under different circumstances and regulatory environments, we want to create a well-diversified system. If we do everything right under the IRA, we will still not develop all our demand here in the United States. We are still going to be way short. I mean, look at the numbers that were presented earlier before this panel on how much more has to be done. And if we're just do the math on how much graphite and lithium and nickel and copper and everything else we're going to be needing in the United States to supply by 2035 to have 100% new vehicle sales, just for the new vehicle sales. That's mind-boggling. We're still going to be importing for the rest of the world. So if you can create a value chain where a value add of not just lithium in Argentina, and by the way, Argentina has that 20% of reserves, but is only, I believe, at 8% of production. So there's a lot of room to grow here. If you can create a center where you're importing the other materials necessary for batteries, remember, just because you have lithium doesn't mean you're going to build a battery there. That's right. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You then have to import all the other products on a sustainable basis and create that supply chain in order to be able to build the battery. So not every place is going to have a battery. You're not going to judge success if you built the car there or you built the battery there. But I think that we can create centers around the world that will have that. And by the way, an Australian company, Jervois, cut a ribbon on starting to mine for cobalt in Idaho, our first primary cobalt mine in the United States. It's not going to stay in the United States. We don't have cobalt processing in the United States. It's probably going to end up, most likely, in the Americas, just not in the United States. Now, maybe one day we end up with processing, and then things can change. So there's going to be movement around based on what the quantity is and where it goes, and that's part of the efficiency of the system that has to optimize. And we do that in everything else. We're not creating an energy system from scratch. We do have experience worldwide with how large systems work. So we need to optimize, and some countries are going to have a battery. But what I get now after the IRA is saying to me, wherever I go, and whichever country I talk to, well, we want to have battery manufacturing. Well, we're not going to have localized battery manufacturing in every single country where there's one of the components for that battery. But that doesn't mean that's a failure. If you can have development, mining plus processing and there are different levels of processing. And you can create value in different ways. It doesn't all have to be one metric of measure of what is a successful value add. I agree that everybody should try to add value to what they have, to their advantage. But I think we all have to look at this as a holistic measure of, did we get enough batteries at the end of the day to supply 100% of new vehicle sales by 2035, which is a big challenge to get to. And that's going to require all of us doing what we can in our own countries to maximize investment incentive. And then and from there, how do we work with each other along the lines of what was just mentioned, what USTR is trying to do with our neighbors in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And the role of DFC becomes paramount in something like this. And that's a whole separate conversation that I hope we can have. But thank you for that, Amos. Sarah, this isn't a fair question because we don't have time to actually address it, but I want to raise it.
It's a great way to start, Eric.
I want to raise it. Exactly, right? So I'm going to just drop it out there like a bomb, right, and watch it explode, and then poor Sarah has to deal with it. You mentioned First Nations and Canada's expertise working with Indigenous communities, and we know from experience across the Western Hemisphere that many of the mining projects are in Indigenous communities, whether it's Peru or Colombia, some of the countries, certainly in Chile, elsewhere as well, Argentina. Is there one lesson that you could give to this audience in terms of the importance of working with the local communities to make some of these mining projects sustainable? Just one bit of wisdom that you could give to all of us in the brief time that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's a massive topic, and it's one that we could talk about for ages. I mean, just to clarify, we don't offer wisdom in this space. We don't offer best practices. We talk about the lessons learned of the Canadian government and our very long and much needed and frankly overdue pathway towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and ensuring proper consultation, ensuring respect for economic development, cultural knowledge, local and traditional ways of life. Are core tenets of that. It is why this is actually a core component of Canada's critical mineral strategy, because these are lessons that we have learned over the years of, frankly, the federal government doing it badly. I'm going to offer an example of something that seems to be heading in the right direction because we are learning those lessons rather than some sort of a best practice or some sort of a word of wisdom, because it's not the federal government's place and it's not appropriate, frankly. But the example I'd like to offer is of the First Nations Major Project Coalition, which has been supported by the Government of Canada. And this is a conglomeration of First Nations representatives on their own terms, in terms of their own needs, defining where local populations need to benefit from economic investment, who began working on oil and gas projects because, frankly, I mean, the topic that we have not discussed is the acute shock to traditional oil and gas that we are experiencing now as we seek to accelerate even quicker the transition to green growth. So the First Nations Major Project Coalition are now expanding their scope and interest into critical minerals projects. They're advising Indigenous communities on how to take equity stakes in these projects as they come online, and really to recognize the fact that the value proposition for Canada and communities is not just in the raw materials that gets sucked out of the ground and sold elsewhere, but also in developing facilities and building expertise further down the value chain, upskilling local opportunities, but again, on their own terms. And I think that is the example I'd offer, Eric, in response to your question of how Canada wants to look at these issues, how Canada wants to partner, and why this is really a central focus of the kind of 5 key areas of the critical mineral strategy that have been highlighted for us.
Yeah, that's a great point. And frankly, there's a lot here to talk about at another session.
Yes.
But I think it's a really healthy approach that you've just outlined. So thank you for that. And I wish we had more time to develop it. We're going to go quickly to our final two. Yeah, exactly. Final 2 panelists to give you one last shot. Adrian, you have a number of high-quality investors in front of you. You have a free shot to give them one final word about Argentina. What word do you want to leave international investors with in terms of Argentina and the prospects there?
I guess they can have confidence on what we are doing I guess there is a strong bipartisan support for carrying out sustainable mining. I guess that the Western companies have a clear advantage over non-Western companies. We speak the same, no, we don't speak the same language, but we understand it. We understand it. We have same time zone, and we share values, many values, very significant values, like such as democracy. And we are a stable country, and mining for the last 30 years has a special regime with stable rules. And although you can have that, our macroeconomic framework is always on the rocks, or almost, the mining sector, and the companies know that, have a stable framework. The money which is invested in Argentina can send out because it's a specific regime. And don't be afraid that we will be very seriously, because mining, oil and gas as well, oil, particularly gas, in this energy transition scheme, with a big reservoir we have, that will play a significant part in helping to mend the macroeconomics, because the external balance, because of growing exports with lithium, take lithium in and of itself, and that will imply more than 5 to 10 billion extra dollars in exports in the next 10 years. That's going to help significantly the Argentine macroeconomics. So don't be afraid, trust, and we highly appreciate your contribution to the development of our country.
Very good. And Daniel, an easy one to close in the short time that we have remaining. Give us a sense of the timeline, if you can, on APEP. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but it is the pregnant question that we're all anxious to know. Or let me ask it differently. Are there guideposts that we can be looking toward as APEP is further developed, and things that we can be perhaps contributing to from the private sector as the program is developed?
Yes. So I think you will be hearing more about APEP in the near future. You're not going to hear everything you want to know. We won't know everything that you want to know, but you will start to hear more about it. So, and part of that will be very much an interest in getting input from, as I say, a wide range of stakeholders, including the sort of people here, to help us shape individual initiatives. And just to flag a few things that's interesting for us to know, I already flagged we are very focused on concrete outcomes, thinking about near-term, mid-term, long-term deliverables. Amos made a really important point. When we hear from countries, our trading partners, they flag areas of concern. Financing is one, and that's something that we will think about in the context of the APEP. Sometimes they talk about workforce development and ensuring they have the sort of skills in their workforce that they need. That's a big issue we're working on in the USMCA. It's a long-term sort of an issue. But mostly they're raising their hand and they're saying that they feel the energy in this issue and they want to be part of it. However, regardless of the sector, we're not going to have a cog in our supply chain in every single country of the world. So we need to hear from you on what will help, but also what you're thinking is on what comes next. If we're talking about extraction, processing, manufacturing the various downstream products, help us get a sense of what's useful from your perspective. Obviously, we'll be talking to lots of different people, but those things are really important. That whole process will start soon. So I can't give you specific timelines because there are a lot of countries and there are a lot of political leaders, but it is coming very soon, and you should expect a lot of interest in consultation.
Speaking of timelines, we are a little bit over ours, which is the sole fault of the moderator, who failed miserably in keeping us on time. But having said that, I did want to extend the conversation by a few minutes because it was a tremendously rich conversation from all of our panelists. Really, really good insights. I wish we had more time. Hopefully Silverado and Principal to Principal will invite us back, at least the panelists, and for continuation of these conversations. One final item of business, if I could please ask all of you to join me in thanking the panelists for their terrific conversation this morning. Congratulations. Well done.
So we're going to take a quick 2-minute break. I need my panelists to come up here so they can swap out mics. So everybody stand up and stretch, but you got to come back. Oh boy.
Okay, everybody, would love for you to
They'll
take
turn
your
you on.
seats so we can get our private sector panel going.
Oh, he wants you, yeah.
And we promise that we are going to give you more break after this panel for more coffee and more to eat.
And more networking. Excellent. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all for sticking around and caffeinating. We will have more time for networking. But I do think we should send a signal to those that are still out there. Give a round of applause to the last panel and the government experts, and also to Sarah, CEO of Silverado Policy Accelerator for the Scene Center. This is our signal to everybody. And then also thank all of you who are watching it live stream. And for those of you that want to see the recording or make certain you can hold somebody accountable to what they said on the panels, we are recording it. So if you want to do that, you can reach out to any of us from Principal to Principal or Silverado. And I think we actually, it's on Silverado's YouTube channel. So with that, I am Christy Rogers with Principal to Principal, and thank you again for being here. I have an extraordinary panel of senior executives from leading industries who are actually at the forefront of the digital transformation, of the forefront of moving well beyond the Industrial Revolution to sustainable solutions and to making certain that together we are competitive. So we heard some recognition from our colleagues in various governments in the U.S. government of the need, of the sense of urgency. We heard some of their solutions on working together and trying to identify some trade tools and sending the right market incentives. Now I think things are going to get a little interesting because we're going to talk to the businesses who are on the forefront. We have CEO Stacey Hasty, who is CEO of U.S. Strategic Metals. We also have Vicky Pesce, who is, now I'm going to get this right, Chief of Staff of Rio Tinto Copper. So 2 companies that are extracting some of our critical minerals. We also have Greg Bowman, Chief Innovation Officer and Vice President of Corporate Development for Siemens Government Technologies. I love glasses. Good heavens. They're on my nose. They're down. And then we also have Tanya Skilton from the, GM, General Motors. And Tanya is the Director of EV Critical Minerals Purchasing and Battery Raw Material Center of Expertise. How does that fit on a business card?
It does not.
So extraordinary expertise. And I want to pick their brains a bit to say, okay, what are you all doing? What are your companies doing to actually make certain we work together, make certain the playing field is level where we can compete with other countries in the Western Hemisphere? And what obstacles and challenges are still in the way that governments could help alleviate by working together and clarifying some things? So with that, thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise up front. Stacy, I'm going to ask you the first question.
Okay.
Because I had heard, part of the reason why we're doing this today, right, is to increase awareness. I heard from Amos in the White House today that we don't do any cobalt processing in the United States. I think you might have something different to say about that, so I'm going to ask you about that. But I also want to ask you, in part of that, your cobalt mine in Missouri is a Superfund site. You have profound experience in working with communities from local, state, and federal. What is necessary to establish a secure, closed-loop metal sourcing, processing, and recycling solution, not just in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere? And then on top of that, what type of support do you need from local, state, and federal government?
Okay. Very long question, but I'll do my best here.
I can repeat some of it.
That's okay. I think I got it. Okay. I would first start off, first of all, thank you for having me. I would first start off, I'd say there are 4 what I call must-haves. Okay. Number 1, if you're going to be in the processing, you need an innovative, cost-effective, green technology for processing. I think that is a must in today's society. You know, we can discuss our foreign competition, foreign processing, i.e. China, but let's face it, they're not very environmentally friendly, and that is a must-have going forward in today's society. Number 2, your site, your mining site, your processing site, must be able to get the necessary permitting. Just like in real estate, location, location, location. In this industry, it's permitting, permitting, permitting. You know, fortunately for us, we have all of our permits in place for the mining, for the processing, refining, and quite frankly, we are looking to reduce the carbon footprint even further. Going downstream, within a few years, we are permitted for PCAM and precursor production as well. So I would call permitting a must-have. You have to have something to process. So obviously, feedstock is very important. Fortunately, we have a good baseline of material because we have our mined ore. Okay, but we also, our technology is capable of taking third-party material. So we can take third-party concentrated ore. We can also take and accept black mass, recycled batteries, end-of-life lithium-ion batteries, battery scrap and whatnot. So we can also take in that material. And so the feedstock comes into something that's very important also that you must have, and strategic partnerships. Everybody's talking about what can we do all together. Well, we're very, very fortunate that we have 2 excellent strategic partnerships. We have one with a battery recycling company who I think is probably producing most of the black mass, if not the biggest producer currently in the United States, called Interco. Long-term contract where we can accept their material and process their material along with our ore. But we also have a marketing offtake agreement with Glencore that we value very much, because not only does that give us, you know, our viability going forward and security financially that we have selling our product, but they also have a reason to refer feedstock to us. So those are the 4 must-haves, I believe, for for the closed loop. You must have all of the 4, and then as for the government, okay, the government's very important, obviously, and I'm going to break the government down into 2 categories of need. One, you work with them on a regulatory basis, and one from a financial. On the regulatory basis, we were, even though it's a Superfund site and it's very complicated, it also required us to work closely with the local, state, and federal government early in the process. So early in 2017, we started working with everyone, did an outreach with the local community. They have a Superfund site. This is an easy narrative to sell. Hey, folks, we're coming in. We're going to clean up your Superfund site. And guess what? We're going to create a lot of jobs while we're doing it and reopen a mine and a processing facility and grow it. Obviously, that's an easy narrative storyline to sell, okay? It gets buy-in from everyone. Then you have to get involved with the state agencies. So in this case, Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And obviously, we're dealing with the U.S. EPA as it relates to the Superfund requirements and the cleanup. So how we approach these folks, we don't approach them like regulators. We approach them like partners. We come in, we discuss expectations, we discuss goals, and we put them at the table with us to discuss how we're going to get to the end goal. And when you do that, the buy-in, interests are aligned, and actually it starts facilitating and streamlining the permitting process. So that's how we worked with the regulators, and I have to say that in meeting with this administration, they want to call this a case study because it did go very well. And quite frankly, when you're doing a remedial action, remedial cleanup on a site, there's a lot of overlap in the activities of the cleanup and the mining. So there's cost efficiencies as well as the streamlining I just brought up. So that's how we endured that. Now, from a financial perspective, I do have to commend this administration for their grant and loan programs. Without a doubt, it was needed to facilitate and entice more people to be in this arena. And I would say that it's probably assisting us as well because, we're going to be applying for different programs and whatnot. If it wasn't for programs like this, our capacity would take, to get to full capacity and continue to grow the capacity might take 8 to 10 years. Now we can probably do it 2 to 4 years. So you're looking at a quick impact. Did I answer your question?
You did, and I'm going to come back to a couple points, but you hit on something that part of the reason why we're doing this, as I said earlier, is we want to increase awareness. So I'm going to pick on a theme that I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists, and we'll probably come back to you, Stacy, and that's about dispelling the notion that technology, manufacturing, mining, processing, refining is as it was in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We have made a lot of improvements. Your companies are leading and on the cutting edge of some of this and implementing some sustainable practices. And when you heard from the governments, actually all 4 of them today, it's about working with partners who have the same values. So when it comes to that, I think I'm going to go to Vicki. Vicki, you're with Rio Tinto, President or Chief of Staff of Rio Tinto Copper. So what are some of the obstacles to developing or relocating, even, I should say, reshoring or regionally diversifying some refining and processing to either the United States or anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere? What are some of those obstacles that you're facing, and what are some of the things that Rio Tinto is doing to make it known that you have implemented some improvements, that there are some sustainable solutions, that there are some greener solutions? And one last point, that by doing it in the Western Hemisphere in the United States, doing it mining and processing, we can actually have less of a environmental footprint than in some other countries that don't have the same values. Very long question, sorry.
No, thank you very much. Thanks, Christy, for having me here today. And I think just by way of introduction, obviously Rio Tinto is the 2nd largest diversified global mining company. But a little closer to home here, we are the largest producers of refined metals, critical minerals, and strategic materials. With our footprint in Canada and the United States. We have 20,000 employees, the majority of which are unionized, and our product comes here mostly for the U.S. domestic market. So, so much about mining, but a lot more about smelting, refining. These are metals manufacturing, so we produce everything from copper to aluminum to titanium borates. And then through those processes, able to, as co-products of our base metals, get critical minerals, rare earths, and strategic materials. So it's hard to imagine building large-scale new processing and refining capacity that we have today, but we can do brownfield expansions of existing. And so what you need, and I'll touch on something that Stacy had said earlier, is certainty of supply. So those raw materials, we can expand smelters, we can expand refineries. Those are very, very large, hundreds of millions to billions. But you need that certainty of raw material and supply coming in. And so that's kind of a constraint. Power, right? The location of where you are located. These are very power-intensive industries. So we have our aluminum refineries in Canada draw on renewable baseload of power. And then, of course, in the Western U.S., solar, right? And we can expand that, and it's very cost competitive. And talent. So there was a time when the United States had 12 copper smelters. We've got 2 that run, and we have one of them. Freeport has the other. And so what do you do so there's really 2 things. If I look at something Stacey said earlier, permitting. We aren't going to bring in copper concentrate from Chile. It's just not cost competitive. But when you do have new supply and you have it in the United States, we have the framework. We have the best regulatory standards. We have the gold standard from, NEPA offers a framework for 2-way dialogue with stakeholders. And so looking at agencies as partners, just what Stacey had said, looking at engaging on before a permitting process starts, what are the resources the agency needs, getting the right baseline of information, engaging local communities. We've got a new copper project in Arizona. It's in the clean copper triangle. It is in the footprint of an existing mine, so it's a large brownfield expansion, but spending time with the 12 agencies, 6 communities on our doorstep, and the 11 Native American tribes that have ancestral ties to the land. Long time before that, and then this framework facilitates this 2-way dialogue. Many changes have been made. Many voices are shaping the outcome of this project to the benefit, right, of many. Transparent, open, so we should be proud of our processes. And then I just say in terms of the partnership, not only in permitting, but with governments on some of these brownfield expansions. Obviously, we're talking hundreds of millions to billions. So a great example we have is we've just recently invested in our titanium scandium facility in Canada. And we've put $500 million into that. And then the Canadian government has pitched in about $200 million. And so we will be decarbonizing it with a new blue smelting technology. It'll be 95% reduction in greenhouse gas. At the same time, we will quadruple scandium production, titanium powders, and titanium metal, right? So I'll be able to do that all in one when you're able to partner together.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thank you so much. And it is a lot of what you're doing. It's important to communicate that, right, as you are doing, so you don't run up into sort of this not in my backyard because the mining as it used to be in the refining and processing. You also hit on something on certainty that Stacey hit on too, and certainty of supply, certainty of sourcing. And Tanya, I'm going to go to you as a executive, leading executive within General Motors, specifically responsible for the purchasing, right, of the critical minerals that go into electric vehicle batteries. How are you tackling the sourcing of these critical minerals for your company and meeting the demand that is surging in electric vehicle batteries?
It's a good question. It is a full-time question and obsession, which is appropriate given the mission that we're on. So maybe I'll start with tooting our horn a little bit and then describe how that came about and how we did it. So General Motors at this point is secure and fully sourced for all of our critical raw materials for electrification through 2025. And that means that we're going to be able to produce up to 1 million vehicles a year, EVs a year, by 2025. And that is a particular accomplishment for the team that's been working on this mission for a while that we're really, really proud of because it underlines the strategy that we have. So obviously we take critical minerals and electrification very seriously. GM as a company has committed that all new vehicle sales by 2035 will be electric. We're starting with the 1 million by 2025, half of our car park by the end of the decade, and then 100% by 2035. And knowing what we talked about earlier in terms of the demand-supply imbalance and right supply imbalance, we know that this is a critical mission. It could be a single point of failure for anybody seeking to electrify. So we take it very seriously, but we're also very strategic about it. A very large company like ours, so our current car park is about 4 million vehicles a year in North America that we sell. So that's a huge amount to cater for. So being strategic about it, we've put together, it starts with organizational commitment to getting this right, to figure out what the strategy needs to be, to find the sources, and then to engage with them in the right way so that we're participating in actually building out that supply chain in the right locations, with the right ESG footprint, with the right cost points for our ultimate customers. We're seeking for it to be secure, scalable, and sustainable. And all three things are critical. And I was talking with someone offline earlier today about how do we prioritize? We've got to prioritize so that this supply chain can come in place. We don't think that we need to compromise on sustainability or, of course, scalability, otherwise the business falls apart, and security. So those three things kind of have to go together. So organizational commitment, the organization that I belong to, the COE that you talked about in my job title, it is a cross-functional team that has a singular mission. It's 100% focused. Every one of us is 100% focused on securing our EV critical minerals. We have access to our senior-most leaders on a weekly basis, talking to them about what we're doing and where we need support so that we can make decisions very quickly and move forward on them. We have team members that are handpicked because they are innovative and they are nimble in the way that they think and creative and collaborative and have backgrounds that support what we're trying to do. And then we have our partners external to our business. Some of them are here, right? The mining companies, the processing companies. We have our partnership with LG Energy Solutions for the cell technology and cell manufacturing. We have partnerships with POSCO Chemical and LG Chemical for cathode active materials, for anode materials, etc. But we're not stopping there. We're going all the way down to the mine site. We absolutely are convinced that we need to have control of our own destiny when it comes to EV critical minerals. So we're engaging, for some of these minerals, we are direct sourcing up to 75% out through past 2030 into 2035, while keeping optionality for future chemistries. So there's a lot of variables to try and take care of. But we're confident that with that sort of ecosystem of partnerships and having a very clear-eyed view of what our mission is and how we're going to accomplish it, we will get there, as we've demonstrated with the 1 million vehicles that we've already provisioned for.
And just to tug on something real quick, going for General Motors, for your company to go directly to the mines and to the source, now that's something new. Isn't that correct or no? Or have you always done that in sort of General Motors history in terms of supply?
It's a good question. So at times we have engaged, for example, with the steel industry, with steel mills in our history. But to go all the way down to mine site is new and unique for us at this stage. It's essential. We think it's the right thing to do. And of course, the stories about all automakers and ourselves included in terms of what happened with semiconductors in the last few years is fresh in our minds. And we're taking a very different view of supply chains and how critical they are to enterprise value creation and sustainability and scalability. And it's a great place to be operating in because of that, because we finally are kind of getting it and investing in that.
That's excellent. I commend the work that you all are doing on that. And going also to Siemens, a major manufacturer of numerous critical goods. I mean, everything from large-scale energy products to trains to medical equipment to permanent magnets and numerous things that governments are your customers as well as industry and us as consumers. And one particular customer that you have is Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense. So with all of the supply chain challenges and some of the choke points, and we're specifically talking about critical minerals, rare earths, you can talk about semiconductors as well, but what is Siemens doing internally to handle these challenges and choke points, address them to still meet the demands of U.S. Department of Defense, and what's the impact on your customers, including Department of Defense?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me here and for what you and Silverado are doing to drive this conversation. And I think it's really important. It's one of the things that Siemens is doing. This morning I came down, I get up early. I spent 25 years in the Army. I can't break that habit. So I come downstairs, and my 20-year-old college student who just returned from college for the holiday break was on the couch at 5:30 with a set of earbuds in her ears, a iPhone, a computer, a television going, and she was sound asleep. and I looked at this, and I'm like, good gracious, think how many rare earth minerals are in all these devices. And from the LED TV to the computer screen to the hard drive in that computer, and I can tell you she was researching EVs, which was a GM EV. She wants one of those for Christmas. She's not going to get it, but she really wants it. But all those things have rare earth minerals in it. And one of the things that we're doing at Siemens is making sure people understand these things aren't, I think rare is almost a misnomer. I mean, there's a lot of it. It's just hard to get. And I think that, raising awareness of that is absolutely essential. If you walk through a Siemens factory, just like if you walk through my living room today, you would see a whole bunch of things that rely on these types of minerals and how important they are to manufacturing processes, how important they are for programmable logic controllers, which is a fancy term to say an industrial computer. And being able to understand how important these things are and how hard it is to get them in a sustainable fashion is a really key aspect of Siemens. I mean, our goal, if you look around, everybody today says we are going to get to 2040 net zero. Siemens says we're going to get to net zero at 2030. And let me tell you, that is not only a stretch goal, that is an overwhelming goal. But it is absolutely essential to our corporation, not only to be good citizens of the world, but also to be good stewards of our shareholders' interests. It was mentioned in the last panel that to follow the money. Well, following the money here also allows us to, in a better way, take care of our world. And so there is profit incentive. We are a for-profit company, but we do it in a way that ensures that the sustainability that we're looking for is provided not only for our own internal use in the products that we make, and as Christy said, we make locomotives, we make CT scanners, we make everything down to thermostats. I mean, we make a whole host of different products, and we do a lot of work with batteries, which is another area that we have to work on sustainability. But as you look at what we're trying to do, our goal is to have a sustainable, predictable supply chain. Now, how do you do that? I mean, everybody talks about supply chain now. We do it through digitalization. And as you look at it, we have shifted from not only a major energy company, but also a tech company. If you talk to our CEO now, Siemens is one of the top tech companies in the world. In fact, we're the #1 software maker for industry in the world. And as we look at how we're developing next steps, we need to make sure there's a way to track supplies. So if it's semiconductors, we buy an enormous number of semiconductors for our PLCs, all of which have rare earth minerals as part of it. So we buy subcomponents. But we also are concerned about how these materials get to our end products. So we have worked really hard to develop sustainable ways to help mining interests capture these rare materials in a way that's sustainable. Further, having green microgrids out to help mines be better able to extract this ore in a way that is environmentally friendly. To also using our digitalization to help them figure out where's the best place to mine. What's the best way to set up the refining? What's the best way to ship it? What's the best way to track it? What's the best way to know that you have a rare earth mineral that comes from the place in which you think it came from, so that you can look at those ESG goals, so you can understand sustainability, so you can understand the importance of knowing where your suppliers are. So when you get an end product, and especially when we're talking with the U.S. government, which from my particular side of things buys a lot of things from us, it's important for them to know where this came from. And so we have worked extensively over the last 10 years developing our Accelerator program and developing our Trusted Traceability program that is designed to track and have visibility over that supply chain. So when you get a product, you know where it came from, you know where the subcomponents came from, and you know how it was delivered to you. That's really essentially important to us because there is not only profit in that, but more importantly, it's sustainability and it's being a part of making a better world. So that's what we do.
Excellent. So we've heard from each of these companies in some of the technologies that they're adopting that are more sustainable, more environmentally friendly. I want to talk a little bit about demand and how you're all meeting the demand. And I want to, research the minerals, as we heard earlier, minerals and the rare earths are found where they're found. We're not moving them. So, Stacy and then Vicki, how is U.S. Strategic Metals helping Siemens get the critical minerals necessary, helping GM get the necessary materials that go into their electric vehicles, and then also the rest of the industry? What do you need and what are you doing to help assist?
Well, the first thing that we're doing, which is definitely a highlight that everybody's brought up, is it's in our DNA to be environmentally friendly. It's just in our DNA. So you're getting ethical from us, okay? So, but what we're doing on the demand side is, number one, we're trying to increase our capacity of our plant, which we are doing. The other things that we're doing are being more innovative R&D type work. For example, when we started processing black mass for nickel and cobalt recoveries, it became very clear that to be in that business, you also need to recover lithium. So we have expanded, and now we're going to be recovering lithium as well. So that's part of the evolution. I think that you just have to continue to grow, get better. And the last thing, which is more important, I brought it up on the other question, strategic partnerships. You must have these strategic partnerships to get your feedstock and everything else. Once again, Interco, Glencore, plus we have a couple more that we'll probably be announcing here shortly that are very important. But I think that's how you have to continue to get the demand. And I believe that it's going to be a bold statement here, but it's the true statement. In June, which I wish Amos was here to hear this, well, I think we're going to be the first commercial processing company in the country, U.S. We'll be making a nickel sulfate and a cobalt sulfate. And like I said before, we're going to hopefully go on downstream for precursor processing as well. So we think that by the end of 24, we could be producing 50% of the U.S. demand. And we think by 26, 27, it's going to grow by quite a bit more.
That's excellent. So opportunities exist in the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely.
To do refining processing.
Yeah, I want to tell all my Latino friends, we're open for business. Send your material to us to process.
So Vicki, in addition to the huge demand for electric vehicles and batteries, there's an absolute astronomical increase in electricity demand. Copper goes into transmission lines and everything with electricity. You, as Chief of Staff for Rio Tinto Copper, what are you doing to help ensure that you're meeting that demand of that increased electricity needs and the transformers and whatnot?
Yeah, so I mean, just recently Goldman Sachs released their copper report, and it is the end of the surplus, right? So we already know that we've been in a 2-decade-long copper deficit. We know that that is only projected to get worse if we're to have 50% of vehicles on the road by 2030. Electric vehicles, we are looking at probably a 70% net import deficit. So we need to think differently about our existing operations, and we need to innovate and partner with government. So just a couple of examples. In the U.S., we have a lot of mines. They're old, right? 100 years, grades are declining, but we can still squeeze value, every little drop we can out of these things, and think a little bit more long-term than short-term. So we're just investing $1.5 billion to look at a multi-year expansion of our Bingham Canyon mine in Utah. And this has not just copper, but it has about a dozen critical minerals and strategic metals that we can produce. These are things that we thought of as waste. I mean, it's only been 2 years, really, that the U.S. government has kind of created this market for critical minerals. We've been throwing these things away. We actually can be recovering them as byproducts and co-products of our base metal operations. As grades decline, you have to sort of think of what else. We talked a little bit about new supply and underground. That's really one of the waves of the future. So within the Bingham Canyon mine, we've just recently invested $55 million to bring on new supply of copper. So we've got an underground mine, so we're going underground for the first time in almost 100 years. This is within the footprint of our existing mine. So again, new supply of copper, critical minerals. And the best thing, it's not good enough that we produce the metals needed for the electrification. We have to electrify our business as well, right? We've got similar standards, right? Net zero by 2050. I think you can probably shame us to do a little bit better than that, right? But we're doing it with battery electric vehicles. So underground gives the opportunity to electrify better. It also has far less water intensity. So underground mines per pound of copper use far less water than open pit, right? We don't have the large amounts of water that we need to use. So with that, you're able to do something better. And one example is again at our Kennecott operation, because we have been more efficient, we are now able to put 20,000 acre-feet per year of water. That's a large amount of water in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, back into the Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake is one of the critical migratory bird stopover areas. It is rapidly declining. It is also what is responsible for the big snowpack on the Wasatch Front, which fuels the ski industry. So we have to care about nature, and I think that mining companies have lots of sources of water to put back in the environment, not only for communities, but for nature. And then lastly, we have to innovate. And so we're really proud of a new technology we've produced called Newton. It's been decades in the making, but it goes after low-grade, complicated copper ores. We can also extract copper out of waste rock, out of tailings. And so we've done 2 investments in the U.S. in old mines. One is in Arizona called Arizona Sonoran. It's the Casa Grande pit. And the other one is the Lion Copper and Gold, which is in the Yarrington Superfund district. So similar to Stacy, we're investing in Superfund sites. So no new footprint, no new disturbance. We projected to squeeze out, lots of new copper, low water, low carbon, and then at the same time clean up an eyesore that has existed in people's backyards for decades. So that's what we're doing.
That's excellent. So Tanya, are there additional partnerships that you see working with other industries or across industry that could help working with or balancing geopolitical and economic and also environmental issues? And I'll just say, we heard from the governments that they're sending signals to industry and market signals. And industry is like, please don't touch us, right? Manufacturing industry. So in your working relationships and working so closely with the mines and other industries, what suggestions or advice do you have, or are there other areas that you could partner?
Absolutely. Ultimately partnerships is what produces value and does it in the right way, where you're consulting stakeholders and working together. So absolutely. I'm just going to spend 2 seconds chuckling about and sharing why I'm chuckling about why this is a great question and why I'm so excited to sit next to Vicky. So I worked at Rio Tinto for 13 years. And so I have this most bizarre sort of resume where I have more than a decade in automotive collectively between GM Part 1 and GM Part 2, and more than a decade at Rio Tinto as well. And so my role currently even more is like, okay, you were genetically modified for this, but which is great. But the reason I'm bringing it up is, so when I first went to Rio Tinto, it was because the company was looking for people that had spent time building purchasing and supply chain expertise in automotive, because that was a time when mining was recognizing that they needed to improve on that particular discipline. I then came back to GM from Rio Tinto because I'd been working on the automation work that Rio Tinto has, where they have fully autonomous haul trucks at some iron ore mines in the Western Pilbara region, northwest of Australia. And that experience was very, very valuable to a General Motors that had newly acquired Cruise Automation and was going on a journey of automation ourselves and wanted to tap into that, as well as I'd been doing some sales and marketing of copper, which we need lots and lots of going forward. And so the synergies and that opportunity to learn, I feel like, has kind of been manifested in my own career. But what we're doing now, I'll give you an example of what GM is doing now in terms of partnerships that are maybe not obvious. So we have a partnership with GE. We probably should have one with Siemens. Okay, good. Where we're going after rare earth elements together. The purpose of the partnership is we recognize that they need them, we need them, and that the supply chain, they're only rare because they're hard to extract, maybe. Sometimes they're smaller deposits, and bringing them to market at commercial scale is the real challenge. And to partner up as customers together, we think we can do more to stimulate that supply chain and its development. So that's one example. There's other things. Greg touched on it a little bit in terms of transparency and tracking your materials and where they come from and knowing the provenance of them. Blockchain technology is something that is going to help various companies and people in this ecosystem that are consumers of critical minerals understand the provenance of their materials, where they came from, the environmental footprint they've left behind, who worked on them, specifically what kind of labor practices are associated with them, all of that, and be able to have, potentially ultimately an ability for a vehicle purchaser, your daughter, hopefully, maybe not Christmas, but maybe early next year. I'm going to advocate for her to be able to look at a label and be able to know where her minerals came from that are in that vehicle. That would be an amazing outcome. And for that type of thing to be true and to happen, it can't happen without partnerships along that whole value chain. And then absolutely there's a role for governments in there. The Inflation Reduction Act came about kind of halfway through the year. And for General Motors, it was a time for high fives and for us to say our strategy is being validated, and we just need to keep going with what we already had planned to go get. So having that kind of affirmation and support that is very tangible is also very much appreciated.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I just got the high sign that I've got one last question. It's going to go to Greg, and then I'm going to do a lightning round. So I'm going to ask each of you to just say one thing that you want to make certain that everybody is aware of about your company and your efforts. So, Greg, I'm going to pull the thread a little bit because you have extraordinary experience inside the government with the Department of Defense and leadership there, as well as working with Siemens and being the Chief Innovation Officer. So on the aspect of partnerships, to meet the demand and address the vulnerabilities, to regionally diversify our supply chains, what would you say is necessary from industry to work with government to tell them what you want and what you don't want?
No, and that's an excellent question, because that is one of the things that having been on both sides now with the government and with industry, just the ability to go in and say, here is what we are working on. For example, Siemens spends $1 billion every year just on research and development across our entire portfolio. It'd be really good if we can hear from government what it is they're working on or what it is their gap is, in order that we can direct our research and development to fill that gap. I mean, that's something that I think is really important. When I was in government, I didn't understand how important that is, because honestly, there's not enough money that can be given to the Department of Defense to get to the innovation that they need in order to meet the challenges that they have. They're going to have to leverage their OEMs. They're going to have to leverage their industry partners. We, for example, work with virtually every OEM that supplies DoD, whether you're talking about aircraft or vehicles or weapon systems. We produce the software that helps them digitally transform their manufacturing operations, just like we did ours, so they can make those things better, faster, and more affordable for the nation's defense. And I think being able to have government as part of that process, where they're able to be in the trenches with their engineers, working side by side in a digital environment. They can see and manipulate and change how those things are developed. They can look at the materials that are being used to create the armor, for example, or to create that stealth technologies necessary for the coating on a particular aircraft. Being in there and being able to be part of the process to get to the end product at an early stage gives the department, the administration, and the world the ability to go in and make trade-offs as to what makes sense. There are some things that we can do that don't require rare earth minerals. There are things that we can do to help recycle rare earth minerals. We can go in and look for alternative mechanisms to achieve the same result that DoD and other customers want without using and relying on these types of materials. And so that's one of the things I think is most important, is the partnership aspect, and to be in the same sandbox, for lack of a better term. You want to be able to, when the OEM has a good idea and the Department of Defense has a problem, we want them to be able to work together in a seamless environment. And so that's what we do for all of our industrial partners. And that's what, as you look at the development stage of what DoD does, both for rare earths and vehicles and other things, being able to be in the same digital environment makes a huge difference, whether it's materials or with capabilities.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. I'm just going to go right down the list. Tanya, one thing that you want everybody to know.
We're going to build this supply chain right the first time, sustainable and scalable. And sustainable is critical, because if you think about the automobile, if someone had asked you 100 years ago, would you like this invention? It could kill a lot of people and it might destroy the environment. We might have said no. We're not going to do it that way this time. It's going to be world changing in a very, very good way.
Excellent. Thank you, Vicki.
Last time I met with the U.S. government about producing critical minerals, we were pretty proud of ourselves that we got tellurium out the door in a matter of years. Now the U.S. is the fifth largest producer of tellurium. We're working with DoD on rhenium, and we, also getting lithium out of waste rock from our California operations. When we ask them, okay, which one next? We have about 12. They're like, we're ready for you to do all of them. So we have to do, I think we are up for the challenge, right? I talked about we're throwing these things away. We're not throwing them away anymore. These things are valuable and we're up for the challenge. Same thing as Siemens spending a lot more money on R&D, thinking about these things differently and rapidly commercializing from R&D to a final product out the door very quickly. So thank you.
Stacy.
Cobalt processing, nickel processing can be done in the United States, period. It will be done in the United States come June. And it can be done at large capacities if you work well with the regulators. And I believe that if we continue to grow that capacity, especially in North America, Western Hemisphere, we can drastically decrease the dependency on China.
Fantastic. Wow, you guys listened to the lightning round. Excellent. So I want to thank you all for your leadership in meeting the demand and also addressing some of the vulnerabilities that we have. And just thank you for being here and your time today. That's it for the panel. So can we have a round of applause for the industry experts? We're going to do a very short networking break because we need to get to our breakout sessions. So everybody's got a color code on their name tags. My name tag is somewhere over here.